And let's continue with the first chapter of the Darkangel trilogy. We now know that Iodowin and Ariel were up in the mountains looking for flowers to make wine and garlands for a wedding that is going to happen at sundown in their village. Unfortunately, their plans were interrupted by a winged vampire attack. Iodowin was overtaken, and Ariel has fallen as well. We'll pick up at the beginning of the paragraph we cut off before. Iodowin! Iodowin! She started to cry. Then her head struck ground with a sickening jolt. The back of her skull went numb. All the sky was white stars for a moment. Her scalp felt wet and warm, then suddenly the brightness dimmed. Iodowin! She heard herself breathe barely once, just before all the light in the world went out. Ariel licked her lips and burned her tongue on the sweetness of horn liquor. She was lying on hard, sloping ground. Jagged pebbles pressed into her back like great pus-pocks, hurting her. She could feel the goatskin bottle on her chest and the warmth on her cheek and throat where it had splashed out, spilling. She was lying on the slope, her head lowest, her feet uphill from her. Her toes were numb. All this she knew without opening her eyes. She opened them slowly, saw the star-littered sky above, through the slight glare of sun in her eyes. She tried to move and found it hard, very hard. Her head came away sticky from the ground with a soreness that made her feel sick and stupid. She got one elbow under her and propped herself up, gazed straight at Oceanus, a huge and constant blue with no shadow of wings across it now. She said, Iodowin, and wept, but she was too weak to weep much. Her hand was cold. All her body was warm in the sun, but her left hand was cold. She looked at it presently and saw that the shadow of a boulder down the slope had crept across it. That frightened her. She snatched it from the shadow and sat up, twisted around too quickly. Her temples pounded. She felt the blood running out of her head, and blotches of darkness wandered across the stars. Sol Star was setting. She could see it as her vision cleared. It was barely 3 degrees above the horizon, and that would diminish as she descended the mountain. She twisted her head around the other way. The pain increased sharply at the sudden move. She could already see the shade of night across the desert to the west. She had 2 hours, maybe less, to get back to the village by nightfall. With the wedding procession about to begin, who would miss one little slave? She chafed the leaden, cold-bitten hand on her lap and felt nothing. It was numb. She groped for the flask at her neck. Yes, there was a little of the liquor left. She poured the bright liquid out onto her limp, waxy hand, then grimaced, rocked in pain as the heat soaked through the frostbite, burned to the bone and then to the marrow. As the heat diminished and was gone, color returned to her hand. She could move it. She got to her knees and then to her feet, took a step, stumbled, and fell. She got up again and started down the slope. The soreness in her head was mostly dull, but when she missed her footing and staggered, the pain stabbed. She clung to the rocks of the mountainside, to the scrubweed, to the crannies. She raked her arm on bellthorn and scraped her knuckles raw when she slipped. Twice the winding trail crumbled beneath her feet and fell away down the mountainside like a tiny meteor shower. And always the sun sank lower as she descended the steep, and the shadows lengthened. The air grew warmer and thicker, her breathing eased. Sol Star was halfway sunk into the sea of dust by the time she heard the marriage hymns drifting into the foothills of the soft plains wind. Strange, it seemed strange, after the airless, muted steeps, that here below, still a quarter-mile from the village, she could hear the singing so distinctly so far away. She listened to the words floating in the long, harsh twilight. Fara atwi, narat miri yumini hadu. Here, the foothills, just coming into the village, the path was much broader, smoother, less steep. She had come this way a dozen times, up to the spring to catch minnows, up to play in the caves and gather mushrooms, and just 6 hours passed, up into the mountains with Iodowin. Ariel grimaced with the pain of remembering. Iodowin had once pulled her out of those dark pools when she had slipped, pulled out by the hair, and pounded her on the back as they knelt, wet and shuddering, on the slick, steep bank, until Ariel had coughed up half a measure of bitter water, and no more would come. That had been 2 years ago. Ariel's head hurt now as she fled down the broad, smooth path by the caves toward the village. She did not want to think of Eodoin. She thought of the music instead. Thyrosidil, Temkinteral, Ma, Amombi, Tembril, Feral. The words were closer now, a little louder. She realized that she was in the village. The smooth, square, whitewashed adobe houses gleamed in the dying light of Solstar. Gathered gauze dripped softly from their dark windows. The great street that ran east-west was a long corridor of light. The little north-south streets were dark as dark. Antuin, Dantuin, Darkangel, Hemb, Letsikchel, Mir Mikchel, Gamperganrend. She was passing the houses more quickly now. She could see the village square ahead, filled with people. Then suddenly she was among the people, who did not seem to notice her, but went on with the singing. Their eyes turned toward the half-gone sun. Pushing past them, she gave a cry to make them stop. The hymn broke off raggedly in mid-verse. The syndic frowned from his place before the bride and groom. The bride in her new woven sari glanced around. Behind her and the syndic, Ariel saw Eodoin's mother, a thin-faced aristocrat with hair like night. Old Bomba swayed beside her, nodding off to sleep even as she stood. Ariel stared at Bomba and the mother. "Eodoin!" she gasped, breathless. The syndic, Eodoin's father, had been standing in shadow, came forward now into the glare. "Yes," he said. "Where is she? The ceremony cannot be completed without the bridal cup." He eyed the flask still hanging from Ariel's neck. "Has she sent you ahead with it?" "She," said Ariel. She could not catch her breath. "No, she—" "Well, where is she, then?" demanded the syndic, pursing his fine lips. He gave an exasperated sigh. "How can that girl dawdle?" Turning back to Ariel, his patience thinned. "Come out with it, drudge, or I'll have you beaten." "Gone!" cried Ariel, marveling that even he did not understand. "The Icarus," she faltered. "The one with wings." The syndic shook his head impatiently. "Are you gaming with me, drudge? Now where's my daughter, your mistress? Where's Eodoin?" Ariel gazed at him and longed to faint. The syndic glared at her and would not listen. The townspeople all stood hushed now, staring. Her head felt light, ached. She felt her balance tip. She swayed, staggered. The syndic eyed her with sudden suspicion. "Have you been tasting of those hornflowers, girl?" Ariel looked back at him in dull surprise. "I hit my head," she muttered, putting her hand to the sticky place behind her and above her ear. She felt something at once soft and stiff amid her tangled hair. She pulled it free from a mat of blood. It was a feather, black, a cubit long. It had been in her hair the whole time she had been coming down the mountain, and she had not known. Realization struck her with the coldness of shadow across strong light. She shuddered once, staring at the thing. Her hand snapped open, but the feather did not fall. Stuck to the half-dried ooze of her palm, she shook her hand, and still it clung, black and blood-damp. She could not bear to touch it, or pull it free with her other hand. The last ray of Solstar winked out, like a candle snuffed. The square was smothered in shadow. All was night. Ariel could still see the vampire's feather, dimly, a black streak in the dark against the paleness of her flesh. No one moved towards her. No one stirred to help her. She gave a long, low cry of revulsion and despair, and swooned. And that is the end of Chapter 1.